Welcome to episode 62 of Building Blocks for Brendan. Today our guest is Jonathan Feilds, the co-founder and CEO of Assembly. Assembly has a simple mission. By utilizing technology, they want to create better company cultures. Since the beginning of COVID when they started, they have grown exponentially, acquiring Series A. Today's episode, we go over Jonathan's story, how he's working nights and weekends on this idea to scaling and growing a series-funded company. We go over the importance of developing a strong company culture and how culture is one of the most important factors as you scale your business. Hope you guys enjoy this episode, learn a bit more about Join Assembly and the importance of culture, and check out their website to see how they're helping companies all around the globe create better company culture by using technology. Hopefully you enjoy the episode.
My name is Jonathan Feilds. I'm the CEO of Assembly. We are a modern intranet, and we're based off two key fundamental principles, and that is really simple: to make work more enjoyable and to save people time, and everything we build interacts with those two key principles. Happy to dive into what that means.
Yeah. So what's really interesting, especially looking at your story, is this kind of came about at the beginning parts of COVID. When you were coming up with the idea, how that came to be? Because obviously you were working, you had a full-time job, you and your founders, and you were starting this as would you say like a passion project or a side project? At what point, I guess the first question is, at what point did you realize you were onto something and you started realizing, hey, this is not just something we're doing for fun, but a real possible business down the road? Was it early on, or was this, I guess, how did it start? Or what was the intention when starting this?
That's a great question. And there are some entrepreneurs who take wild amount of risk. I think there's risk and there's calculated risk. I'm a risk taker, but I'm more of a calculated risk taker. I know a couple founders that, leveraged or mortgaged their house, like double mortgage on their house, and had kids at the same time and did all these wild things for a chance of success. It is wild. If you're doing that is bonkers. I have huge respect, but that's a scary thing to do. So I was at a company called ZipRecruiter really early. I was one of the first 10, 15 employees, and we scaled it to 1,500 employees. And if you've ever listened to a podcast, I'm sure you've heard their advertising messaging because they're literally everywhere. So, I saw a company grow from small to large. And during that time, I became obsessed with B2B SaaS, and I became obsessed with culture in particular. Watching a company grow where you're all in one room to multiple different locations, different time zones, organizational structure as you grow creates hurdles. And how do you communicate with one another? How do you build, especially in this post-COVID world where you're not all together, how do you build an asynchronous community? And as the company was growing at ZipRecruiter, I realized there was a tool for performance management, a tool for communications. We had Slack, we had feedback loops, we had contests, and all these things, by the way, lived in separate tools. They were so phenomenal at culture at ZipRecruiter, but I realized, why is there a tool for each thing? And I wanted to build a platform that consolidated an employee experience into one platform. The eventual goal of building Assembly was to build this comprehensive experience suite. But that was not really possible because I wasn't ready to quit my great job, nor were my co-founders. Before, just from an idea. Everyone can have an idea. Ideas are cheap, but execution is obviously everything. We started building nights and weekends. It was a really fun side project. It was it was interesting. We got a couple companies live. And by the way, the first product was only a very small portion of what is now a piece of our comprehensive suite. We started actually building recognition and rewards as our first product. Mm-hmm. So there was no concept of announcements, document storage, search, larger scale employee engagement tactics, which we can get into of what we offer today. It was just recognition and rewards. Companies recognizing peer-to-peer, top-down, bottoms-up. And we got it into a couple companies' hands. We built it bootstrapped, nights and weekends. We launched it. We had a few happy paying customers, by the way. And a local VC named Dustin Rosen from Wonder Ventures heard about us from the CEO of a company that was using us. It was like, everyone's using it. They love it. They're talking about it. Will you take my money? Which was kind of interesting because I wasn't really thinking of investment capital. And he found us. And so it kind of put the idea in the mind. All right, we're kind of onto something. We wanted to build this much larger. So we actually took the money while still working full time as employees at other companies, for nights and weekends. I don't know if I assume that's very frowned upon, but we did it regardless,
Very
and it was kind of off
post-COVID
to the
thing to do.
races.
Very post-COVID thing to
Yeah,
do.
this was
Pre-COVID.
pre-COVID,
Yeah,
so
pre-COVID. Yeah.
definitely frowned upon then for sure. Maybe a little bit easier to do now in this work from home lifestyle, but pretty different world. But that's essentially how we got started. It was really a nights and weekends project, and even though we wanted to build a comprehensive suite, nights and weekends, you have to make choices and sacrifices. And we started verticalized in the recognition and reward space, but it's been off to the races ever since.
Once you started getting that investment, or that conversation was happening, did you have a conversation with your co-founder saying, hey, when's our jumping off point? At what point are we going to be able to leave our current organizations to go full time? And like you said, it's nice to scale part-time and do a part-time, but at some point you have to make that transition. So was the conversation of like, hey, once we get to X, we're going to quit our jobs, or was it more organic based on the company's needs along the way?
Yeah, I think it was definitely more organic, but it also happened to, in retrospect, is it the additional, the first money we talked about was pre-seed. We actually raised the seed round of investment from Homebrew. They're incredible, by the way. If you look at their portfolio, it's wild. So I still feel honored to be a part of that portfolio company. There's a lot of amazing organizations in that group. But it was a combination of, we started to actually get some traction at the early scale. You can grow like 100% a month. It's really easy to get like really crazy percentage gains at that scale, starting from zero. So the growth was, fairly impressive in the early days. Plus, we were able to secure financing from Homebrew. So I was able to pay myself and the other co-founders terrible salaries, but salaries nonetheless. And go full time. And that happened, when the world kind of plummeted, we're like, oh, let's do the riskiest thing possible by starting our own company. So it was, prime COVID of 2020, around June, when we all, the four founders went full time.
And it's, like you said, super interesting how you decided to obviously quit your job, do the business during COVID times when nobody knew what was going to happen. It was I guess most of our lives, the most unique time, especially within the corporate world, where every analyst in the world was saying 1,000 different things and everyone had no idea where it kind of to look or what the risk portfolio would be, especially, or how long it would last. I remember every week it'd be, next week things are going to open again. Oh, next week we'll come back in office. And we're still not in office. So that was like 4 years ago at this point almost.
Yep.
Obviously you started this before you knew COVID was going to happen, and teams although some were remote, a lot of them were still in person. COVID occurs, everyone moves to working remote. Did you realize early on that, hey, this is a great opportunity to grow this business? Like, this is a great time in the market? Or was there no realization early on, because no one knew what COVID was going to happen, that the timing was almost perfect? And did the remote shift help the business, or were teams so not scared of going remote, but like no one was looking at tools early on? How that beginning part happened? Because I feel looking back, it sounds like a great time. You're doing an engagement tool. Engagement relatively could be seen as an all-time low for a lot of organizations going remote. But was that the case, or was it just B2B sales slowed down so much it was still a challenge early on in the early days?
Yeah, there was probably a 2-month period where nobody knew what was happening. And that was, if you looked at the stock market, I would say our business impact was directly in correlation with the stock market, which is pretty wild, because as the world plummeted, everyone's like, I don't know what's going to happen. Everybody shut down expenses across the board. So we're like, we don't know what's going to happen yet. We're quitting our jobs. This is crazy. But as soon as it came back, it was like if you look at the stock chart, it's like a very sharp V curve.
Yeah.
And once people came back, everyone's like, oh, crap, I do not know what I'm going to do with a remote work environment. Companies were not suited for that. And additionally, at the same time, companies were still worried. So in this space, which we started with recognition rewards, people weren't advertising. So the cost per click advertising at the moment actually went down. So our demo volume went up with very little capital going into it. And then we found the need when we were talking to people, like, I don't know what to do. So it actually was a catalyst to spark the growth in our business. And when we started getting more and more companies on the platform, we started to learn, our grand vision with an employee experience platform, what does it look like in the first place? What are the actual needs of the business? So the short answer to your question is yes, it actually helps us a lot. And it's still helping us. Asynchronous communication, whichever way you look at that, whether it's announcements, finding information, recognition, surveys, feedback, contests, you have to do it digitally. If you have an asynchronous, user base or employee base, what used to work doesn't work anymore, and you need technology to assist along the journey.
And what you talked about with that, almost like the V curve in regards to organization growth, same thing happened. I started working within the mental health space at the beginning of COVID. I think we were doing, we're a team of 15 at the time. I was similar to you at ZipRecruiter. I was employee number 15. We're going in starting B2B sales. I think we're doing one demo a week. 2 months after, funny enough, we got 80 demos in 1 month. So it was the same thing where everyone was like, hey, it's probably a little similarly where people were realizing, hey, people are working remotely. Mental health is struggling, especially with COVID, this uncertainty. What are these digital solutions? And in the market, for us, there's not many digital-based solutions, or we call it, digital first, where you could go see a therapist online, kind of like a BetterHelp, but more focused on the B2B space. So I lived through a very similar thing, going through that scaling, going from 15 to now I think 250 employees within that space. And same thing, wellness, and especially with employee engagement and culture being such a big hot button topic that now is still fiercely debated on, do we return to work? Do we say semi-remote? What is hybrid? What works best? When building this solution, obviously you said you started vertical. How were you able to make the decision between going from, focusing on one product to differentiate, adding other features? Because obviously every feature is great, but that may blur the vision of what your business really does. How are you able to choose what products to build in what order? Was it based on customer need, or did you have looking back, like a map on like, this is the end solution we want to get to? What's the best way to navigate it there?
Yeah, that is a tough question because it caused a lot of internal hurdles to get there along the journey. The path from A to Z was definitely not smooth. We know we wanted to be a comprehensive engagement solution. We know we wanted to have a one-stop solution for all these different types of communication modules. And at the time, the only thing that was consistent amongst our user base in terms of companies was the fact that they all wanted something else. Mm-hmm. Some companies wanted surveys. Some company wanted CEO announcements. Some companies wanted anonymous suggestions. Some companies wanted contests, or the list went on and on and on. And so to start from Z, where we are today, to give you a little context, we are a modern intranet. We're very engagement focused compared to most, which are very announcements or maybe just search focused. We are our roots come from engagement. And so we focus on three main things. And those three things are pushing information. So from a company perspective, admins, comms, or even managers to their teams can send out announcements to their organizations. You can send it to Slack, Teams, mobile, our platform, email. We're actually launching text message in the near future. You can distribute it to multiple different locations, and then you could send it to company all. You could send it to a division, a department. We have all of your HRIS data. You could send it to managers only. You could send it to even an individual. Mm-hmm. And when you do send an announcement, we'll actually tell you who saw it, who didn't see it. We'll give you analytics on the content that you push out. And for your important information, we're guaranteeing you get eyeballs. And if we don't get you those eyeballs, we'll tell you where do those eyeballs, where are you missing? So that's a huge piece. So that's one of the main focuses today, is just like the communication of sharing important information. The other piece is finding information. And I hear a lot of podcasts, they talk about like, is it luck? Is it skill? Well, finding information, search, has been around forever. Obviously, everyone thinks about Google, but what does company search look like? And in I'd say the olden days, I'm talking about like still today, people think about search as like, I'm going to organize information into folders. Now, this is a bold concept here that a lot of people listening to this are going to be like, you're wrong, or it'll take you a minute to get there. The concept of the folder is dead. Mm-hmm. You do not need folders anymore. It is irrelevant. So today, the way you think about it, you have a folder, a nested folder, a folder inside of a folder inside of a folder. How much time do you spend organizing your information? The only reason you have to organize your information is because you have to find things based off key terms, mm-hmm. or the titles. You don't have to do that anymore. So the way assembly is built, AI has become almost commoditized. ChatGPT, Bard, OpenAI, they've changed the game. It's totally different now. So for example, assembly can connect to all of your documentation tools, your G Drive, your OneDrive, your SharePoint, your Box, your Dropbox, wherever you're storing your company information. And there's so many folders and old information. And if you want to find something, you need to know where it is, or you have to go into a folder, into a folder, into a folder. Regardless, it takes time. And even when you find the document, you have to open it up and read the thing. So for example, if you wanted to know, like, what's my PTO policy? You either have to know where it is, go to your employee handbook, Control F, find PTO policy, or maybe it's called something else. Maybe it's called vacation leave. You have to find the key terms. You have to look for it specifically. That is taking you a lot of time. In today's world, you don't have to do that. We have an AI bot that we call Dora. And in our platform, yes, we connect to all your tools. You can search PTO policy, and yes, we'll show you the list of the documentation that matches that. But instead of just searching the old-fashioned way, you can just ask Dora, what is our PTO policy? Within a fraction of a second, Dora will now answer the question as you expect it to be answered. It'll say, the PTO policy, as if you've ever used ChatGPT, it's kind of the same thing, but withholding your company's permissions. Mm-hmm. Like, you can't ask, what's the salary of this person? You only get access to the right things, to the right people. Mm-hmm. That's the hard part. It's like every company could theoretically launch ChatGPT internally, but the permissioning is difficult. Mm-hmm. Not hallucinating is difficult, doing all these things. But when you ask, what's my PTO policy, it gives you the answer exactly as you want. It's like, your PTO policy is unlimited. Here are the steps you need to take to alert your manager when you're taking more than 2 weeks. And here is the source documentation to which the answers were derived from. So if you think about the application, you don't need folders. You don't need to ask people, like, what if you had sales battle cards to, sell against a competitor? What if you needed marketing assets? What if you needed product understanding? We can read through your documentation and give you the answers. I mean, we're saving companies who are early adopters of our search technology hundreds of hours a month. It's unbelievable. So we're talking about pushing information. We've talked about finding information. And then, of course, engagement. We have a very robust recognition rewards platform. We have amazing surveys. And by the way, with our surveys, our AI bot floats over that as well. So if you run a survey with 1,000 people, you get 1,000 open-ended answers. You have to read through those in the old world. Today's, you don't have to. You can be like, summarize this information. Give me the action items and next steps. What does it look like? The ability to save people time is unbelievable with AI. If you're not leveraging AI in your company today, you are making a mistake. And so our engagement suite is very robust. We can now help people find information. And we're pushing information really well. So that's kind of where we're focused today. But to take the long route to answer your question of how did we get there? We didn't know what to build, which caused a lot of problems. And so instead of building one feature, what we actually did was we took, we were super inspired by the companies of like Coda, Notion, Airtable, all these no-code platform tools. And so what we did, instead of building all these things module by module by module, like every other player, what we did is we actually built a form, a very flexible form. Now, if you think, what is a survey? A survey is a form. If you're going to recognize a coworker, you're essentially filling out a form. If you think about pushing out an announcement, well, filling out an announcement is just, you're filling out a form. It's just like a documented form in the structure. If you wanted to do an honest suggestion box, if you wanted to, all of these things are forms, one way or another. They just look pretty in certain regards. And so instead of building one thing specifically, we actually built a form builder that can build a million different things. And that's how we got to learn what were people doing. So when we built this form builder, we saw how were people using it, and then we doubled down on the features and templates that people started gravitating towards organically.
That is very unique, because I was thinking, like, because you touched on obviously all these different things. You're working on everything you can do with your product, but it's like, how do you know? And like you said, I've worked in B2B sales and in B2B space my whole career, and everyone loves, like you said, everyone has an opinion. I need this feature, that feature. And until you build it it's always hard to justify the cost. They always say, yeah, if you build it, I will pay for it. Oh, can you give us the money now and we'll build it? Oh, no. I have to wait. I have to see it first. There's always that chicken and egg
Of
problem,
course.
especially within the B2B world. But your approach to obviously building the form and saying, okay, you say you want this. Are you willing to create the form and do it? Are you willing to invest a little bit of your time to really get the product you want, and seeing where that goes is a very interesting way of kind of doing that MVP, but really getting the customers to say, hey, if you really want this and you're committed, let's see what you build. That's very unique approach. I haven't heard of many times, but obviously works very well because then you can know where to put the resources behind without having to build it and hope that the surveys, as we all know, are truthful, especially when it's people asking, what can we do better versus what are you willing to pay for? And can you give me the money right now and today, which is always that challenge within the startup world. Was it hard shifting the mindset to that more of the founder approach, being like, hey, there are some unknowns we have to take into a consideration, or not hopes, but there is some larger risks to take here because the numbers, our run rate is a guesstimate based on X, Y, and Z, or because you work within startup, was it pretty easy to kind of switch your brain on to that, hey, things might not be as clear as a typical finance mentality might make it, or was it not a risk or not a challenge at all?
I don't think anything in the startup world is not a challenge. So I'm going to
Yeah.
say everything is a challenge one way or another. But once again, like the decision to go full time, once again, it was calculated risk. So we launched with recognition rewards. We started to see some initial success. We started to do pretty well in the market. It's a smaller market, but we started to do pretty well. And as we added the form builder, we saw companies adopting like announcements, or we saw companies adopting surveys. We saw a couple things happen, and that allowed our growth to the curve to go from, a pretty decent growth rate to a little bit of an escalation, a more steeper incline. And that actually allowed us to raise capital to really dive into what we wanted to build. So we did want to prove that we can, and this was the analytical side of my brain working. I wanted to get to a certain metric, like, you have to hit 1 million in ARR, right? It's like that's the de facto. If you look at Y Combinator, talk about Series A companies generally hit $1 million in ARR. So it's like, okay, let's get to $1 million in ARR before we start taking big risks. And I will give credit to Homebrew. They like to say a lot of companies who hit Series A, you're not de-risking, you're actually re-risking. And we fully leaned into that mindset where we re-risked, to go from what we were calling ourselves an engagement suite, advertising on a couple key terms that we know people wanted to buy, to an intranet. We kind of hate the word intranet because it's like everybody's mindset goes to like, SharePoint or like a 1994 homegrown, ugly version of what an intranet is. That is not us by any means. We're more of like a AI-backed Facebook-looking platform, that solves your problems and engages extremely well across the board. But when we raised that Series A capital, we started to lean into what could this platform become, and then with the commoditization of AI, definitely right place, right time, because there are companies in the intranet space that have spent at least $50 million on AI and getting the right answers to people, where you can plug into OpenAI now, or there's like 50 different libraries that are focused on, B2B SaaS, kind of like what we're doing. You can plug into these libraries. Our AI out of the box is better than what you would have invested $50 million into, which is crazy. I mean, it is magic. It feels like a magic trick when we can deliver answers across a company's corpus. It's like the concept that Notion brought out of the second brain. We are a second brain to organizations. We are a time saver dramatically for organizations. We deliver not just documentation, we deliver answers instantly. So we definitely re-risked. We're still early. I mean, the technology is brand new, but it is flying off the shelves and it's solving tremendous problems for organizations. So, you talk about catching people in their journey. We're in the middle of it right now. We're all in on this thing, but it's awesome. It's awesome to watch. It's a very exciting time for us here at Assembly.
It is very interesting how obviously this, talking about the brain and neural networks, the classic computer term for really what it is, thinking like the humans think, which is always that paradox where it's hard to explain, but getting the answers to your questions, not just sorting in folders like you touched on, is dead. The fact of machine learning and neural networking allowing you to get answers to questions that, and I worked in that tech space when even like 10 years ago when I was first getting into it, people were like, AI. Well, what can AI do? It's like Google. And now AI, like you said, it is pretty much magic. Mostly due there is a little fact that it is in a black box where no one actually knows how the system is learning to some extent when you talk to the AI experts, but it is being able to answer questions that are never, like you said, 5 years ago, would never been possible. You couldn't really develop an AI unless you were a $1 trillion company. And still then it was really doing basic things. So it's really interesting how fast the industry and business is growing to allow businesses to really scale, but most importantly, get right information at their fingertips as effectively as possible. Obviously, working in this space, there's a lot of, I'm assuming you get a lot of questions on, company culture and really developing that ability to have the ability to really learn within the organization. This is maybe a little bit of a loaded question, but what have you found, especially growing this business, that people get wrong with company culture? Because I feel company culture has always been a thing, and now maybe just the news. There's always this lack of, maybe teams working remotely, not feeling the same culture or having a lack of culture. In your view, what are some of those things that maybe companies are getting wrong with culture that are maybe misunderstood or just not really hitting the mark?
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk to every type of organization,
Mm-hmm.
and we have companies from manufacturing to marketing organizations, real estate, technology, healthcare, you name it, we have it on the platform. And we could see some common mistakes. Obviously, if they're looking for a solution like ours, they're looking to invest into their culture. So, causation or correlation,
Mm-hmm.
it's we can debate that at another point in time. But a lot of companies, they run, for example, once a year survey. They're using Qualtrics or
Mm-hmm.
they're using Gallup, which helps them run surveys. The big name survey companies, they use them once a year. But then what's the actionable items you take away from it? And it always comes down to a couple things. Most of the survey results that you look at from these large companies are the same, and they're the same every year. I don't feel appreciated for my hard work. There's not enough career advancement. I don't feel informed on leadership decisions. Like I'm not informed as an organization. So at the end of it, communication, career advancement. And communication could be appreciation, it could be feedback, it could be connection to your manager, which is oftentimes the reason you leave an organization. But what are you doing to resolve that? And not enough companies, there is a mind shift change happening right now where the CFO of the organization thinks of it as a nice to have or a cost center. But just look at the data. What does retention cost you? The results are pretty crazy. I mean, if you lose an employee to rehire, there are costs on an applicant tracking system, on a job board. But then those are the minor costs, or a recruiter, by the way, which could be up to 20% of the first year's salary. Then there's the training cost. There's the morale loss. There's all these things that go into what does it cost to rehire an employee? It's very expensive. And people don't, people like to put band-aids once something bad already happened versus investment into something to prevent it from happening in the first place. We're seeing that happen all over the world. It's a concept that maybe will never change. But as a concept, employee engagement is becoming more popularized. And to your point earlier in this conversation, work from home and the need for asynchronous connectivity is being discussed more frequently, is becoming a part of typical conversations versus maybe in 2019 pre-pandemic, it really wasn't as hot of a topic. So it's going everywhere now. It used to just be technology companies that were thinking about this for the most part, but now it's manufacturing, it's real estate, it's medical. I mean, it's everything across the board. So it is becoming more popular as a concept, but it's still not to the place where it should be.
It is very interesting how retention, like you said, is a lot of times, I guess now is much more aware, people are more aware of the cost of it, but it is such a highest cost center for many organizations and obviously the side effects with company morale and many other things. But you also touched on recognition. I think that is probably the biggest thing from even within the mental health space a little bit. That was always the biggest factor that I found going remote. People took for granted. I think in office, sometimes you can have a little bit easier to get recognition because there's face-to-face time. But now when remote, you need that asynchronous solution to be able to connect with people. And I mean, if you read any behavioral science, and huge fan of Kahneman, it's that getting recognition, good or bad, or just hearing from someone is more effective than hearing nothing is the worst thing you can do. Based on all the research, it's worse than telling someone it's bad work, because at least that person you're telling, there's some constructive feedback there. So I get, all that work we've spent years, like you said, years developing, like how to make people happy, how to develop better culture. It's always an endless battle, but I think going remote really showed the fact that there are some things you have to have that recognition, because like you touched on, people don't leave bad companies, people leave bad managers. And that is more apparent now than ever, because you can track which team has the highest turnover and maybe some of the causal factors there. But obviously it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, expressing it just the way you described it, if you don't get appreciated for your hard work, let's say you go above and beyond, you go the extra mile, you stay up late, you finish this project, you get the company to the goal, and nobody thanks you for it. What are the chances that you do it again? That you sacrifice personal time, family time, things that you really want to do. You made a huge sacrifice for your organization. What if no one appreciates you for it? What are the chances you do it again? And I think the answer is slim to none. Mm-hmm. Or you're just coasting, you're quiet quitting, or as they've been calling it over the last couple of years. Or you're just coasting because you gave it your all and no one gave you the appreciation and acknowledgement you deserve. And so there is a secondary concept. That is the first one where it's like, people should be thinking about that. If you're not appreciating your coworkers, you should be. Just point blank. But another concept to, CFOs out there, and everyone has to be budget conscious today, of course. These are different times. The focus on profitability is different than it was over the last couple of years. Zero interest rate environments made it possible to not care so much. But, you have a 7% mortgage loan out there, or, cost of capital is expensive. You have to be thoughtful about it. But here's the real truth. People are like, what if I spend so much money investing into an employee on their career development or employee engagement or sentiment or feedback, whatever it might be, and then they leave? People are like, what if I do this huge investment, this tens of thousands of dollars into an employee, and then they leave us? Well, that's a really scary thought, of course. It is. It's a super expensive risk that you're going to take. But here's the complete opposite. What happens if you don't invest into that employee and they stay at your organization? Mm-hmm. What if they're not great? So I would say a more productive employee, a more efficient employee, a more connected employee is more productive, and more productive employees are better for your bottom line. Any way, shape, any way you slice and dice this thing, that is a better employee. So food for thought for companies not investing into employee engagement, employee growth. You should be.
And it is such a large thing where there's always thoughts of, well, if you invest, like you said, you invest in people or you invest in a solution, what happens if they leave or if there's turnover? But people always like to segment things where, well, what's your current turnover? People are already leaving and you have to pay to replace them. And like we touched on, that's a huge cost. And the cost of replacing an employee, most of the time, I will say, is multiples more expensive than having training or recognition or anything else. But it's always that, like you said, it's always the symptom. It's so much easier and much more effective to really look at the causation of things or what's causing it. But a lot of times organizations tend to just focus on the symptoms because it's easier on an analytics standpoint to say, okay, this went wrong, I fixed this one problem. Much harder to fix the core root cause. But like what Joint Assembly is doing, being able to really solve the issues, which tend to come back to culture or recognition or other key factors that will cause higher turnover, will cause employee unoptimization, or I guess being less effective. One thing a lot of founders speak of, and it kind of, as we wrap up here, this is always a question I like to ask is, as you scaled and grown, being, part of your co-founders and working as this is a side business early on to raising funding and having a small team and now growing the company, what have you found had to change? Expect maybe the way you lead or the way you speak or the work you do, going from that, 5 employee to more and more employees. What have you found being the biggest change? And was there anything surprising going from a startup to being more now maybe a small business now? Was there something that surprised you with what requires from a leader to change growing through those stages?
Yeah, ironically, it's not the business piece that was the harder part. It's part of the process, right? And I've helped companies scale, building a product, collecting feedback, iterating, launching quickly, learning. It's all a process that you can do over and over and over again. There's a cycle. You know how to do it. You don't know you don't know what's going to come of it. But the thing that's actually been difficult, obviously, from growing the team is just personnel. How do you lead? How do you motivate? How do you give effective career enhancements and opportunities? These are things that are just not there when you start a company. There's no plan in place to make sure every employee feels empowered to get a promotion every, 12 to 18 months. How do you make sure people are hitting their own personal goals? So ironically, we use our own platform for, consistent one-on-ones and reviews and feedback. We're really on top of it. But that is something that is not your first order priority. Like when you start a company, it's like survival.
Mm-hmm.
You're not thinking so much about, what is this person doing? What is that person doing? But you absolutely have to. That's what we're preaching, and that's what we do internally. You have to. But it's not the first thought. Your first thought is survival. So it's one of those things that you have to like switch gears and run a dual process of like company survival, growth, product releases, et cetera. But you also have to run with the same level of intensity. How do I make sure my employees level up their skill set? And if they do leave assembly or whatever company you're working at, can they get an amazing job? And if they can get an amazing job, is it because of the skills that you help them acquire while at your organization? That is the goal. I want every employee, should they want to leave, which of course I hope they don't, to be able to get a ridiculously good job. That also makes me proud.
That is, I hear all the founders I've spoken to are relatively successful. Always touch on that. I heard one of the founders I spoke to speak about their goal is that when someone, if they, they don't want people to leave, but if they did leave, in their LinkedIn profile, they would have X, that company name, to be they're proud of where they went, because, typically when you have X ABC company, it's because that company is effective, great training. And that was like kind of their goal, which is a very unique way of approaching it. And funny enough, working for startups, one of the best founders I ever had when I was joining their company, they spoke to me. I said, hey, what does the 5-year plan look like, for my career? And they said, look, I can't make any promises because we don't know what 6 months is from now, but I promise I'll have these candid conversations with you along the way, because I don't know what 5 years is going to look like, but I promise we're going to work together to figure out where your career can go through there. And I found that, like you said, that way of having conversation, or at least transparency, more relieving than anything else, because I've been in many times working for startups where it's like, hey, your on target earnings are this. Has anyone ever hit it? Nope, because we're entering a new market. We have no idea what it's going to be like. So having transparency is so important in the early days, especially
Gotta love the
sales.
startup game.
Love that startup game. Yeah, on target earnings, $500,000. How much have you sold? We haven't sold $500,000 as a company. So I've been there before as well. And those companies aren't around anymore for obvious reasons, but it's always very interesting. But yeah, as we wrap up here, if you want to learn more about your story, more about the business, what's the best way to learn more, get connected, or at least hear about your journey along the way?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways. If you want to learn more about the organization, reach out to support@joinassembly.com. If you want to reach out to me directly, it's Jonathan, Jonathan, @joinassembly.com. Happy to hear people's thoughts, excitement, feedback, good, bad, either way. I've learned to love it all. So feel free to reach out.